She presented her perspective on this case. She began by explaining why there were problems when it came to building a case against Ed Buck.
The challenge was that the defendant, Mr. Buck, calls the police, says there's somebody who overdosed in my apartment and distress. And so the sheriff's department, whose jurisdiction is, came out, and they saw that Mr. Moore was dead. But they investigated it sort of like an overdose. And they found some things, but we contend that it's illegal how they searched for it. They needed a warrant in order to get that stuff. So that was the first thing. Evidence found at the scene of drug use in state court could never come in.
And let's talk a little bit more about this, because as I understand it, and this has just recently come out, this has to do with the red toolbox that was found, and the fact that, as you mentioned, because this was being treated as an overdose situation and not necessarily as a homicide, perhaps it was handled differently. As you see it, what should have happened, what didn't happen, and whose responsibility was it?
In every criminal case, mistakes are going to be made in the investigation. I've never seen a case where there wasn't at least a few mistakes along the way. And I want to be clear about that, because the sheriff's deputies who responded didn't really know what they had and sought the advice, I understand, from a coroner's investigator who said, well, according to a government code, and coroner's investigators can look for the dead person's special effects. They can search for those kinds of things, but it's got to be the immediate area. And the sheriff's deputy erroneously felt that that could be used to justify a search for evidence. But there's a specific case decision that says that that code cannot be used by law enforcement to search for evidence.
Yeah.
And so that came in, but that's not the only challenge.
Yeah.
Because remember, it's the drugs in Mr. Moore's system, right, that we're really talking about. There could be drugs all around, but the drugs in his system. So we had to look for evidence that Mr. Buck furnished Mr. Moore with the drugs, or that he injected Mr. Moore with the drugs, and disprove that Mr. Moore injected himself. And we just didn't have the evidence on the scene. A few people came forward and said, hey, this happened to me back in 2013. And when you get a witness like that, that's helpful if you can corroborate their credibility. Some would tell us things, we'd go and check, and we just couldn't corroborate that they had reported it to the police. We couldn't corroborate that they had even sought medical care. So we know, because we're experienced lawyers, that that's not going to hold up in court. You have to be able to prove to jurors beyond a reasonable doubt, 12 jurors, in order to find you guilty.
Were you frustrated? I'm sorry to jump in, but you're very calm and matter of fact in all of this, which I imagine you have to be in your role, but you've got all these people calling for his arrest. A second man dies in the course of all of this. Was there ever a point, I mean, if I found that you have this, what could be used as evidence, but now you can't, how does that make you feel?
It's extremely frustrating, because we as prosecutors, if we think someone is guilty, we want to do our best to make sure that they're brought to justice. But our justice system is based on testable evidence. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
You can't bring in a mob, a crowd, and say to the jury, well, the mob says they're guilty, so you better convict. Those of us who have dedicated our lives to the justice, those trial lawyers understand that, and I understood that. So it was extremely frustrating. People would show up on our doorstep and they'd say, I can help you. I've got witnesses that'll talk to you. And then we try to talk to the witnesses, and they would, invoke their right to remain silent and say, it might incriminate us. And so then we ended up giving out letters of immunity to people, and we would say, we don't care what you've done, as long as it's not a murder, obviously, but will you talk to us? And they'd come in. Some of them would come in, some wouldn't. When the second man died, we had more people coming forward, but once again, we'd have people come in and say, I've got evidence, and then we'd say, all right, show it to us, and nothing, zero, right? They wouldn't have it, or they'd have a story that we just couldn't corroborate. And so there we were, stuck. 2 men died, the community wanting justice, and not having enough admissible, credible evidence to get the ball over the goal line. Remember, they talked about prosecutors being the quarterbacks. Extremely frustrating. Extremely frustrating. And the myth that we wouldn't prosecute someone wealthy when the victim was poor was such a miscategorization of the LA County District Attorney's Office. We help poor people day in and day out. We prosecute politicians, wealthy. We don't care. We don't care whether you're black, white, blue. If you did the crime, we're going to prosecute you. And we certainly don't take into account the victim status. So that was extremely frustrating. And there was a lot of pressure. But as a prosecutor, you have got to be strong enough to withstand that pressure. You can't.
Well, and it wasn't just about the wealth. It was about how he was using his money that I think a lot of people have questioned and have been skeptical about. This was a gentleman who had, over the course of many years, spent somewhere around $500,000 to various causes and candidates, including you. Although I think it's really important to note that if I understand correctly, the amount he gave your campaign was $100 in 2012.
And we gave it back.
Yeah.
We gave it back after this case broke. I didn't know this man, never met him. He gave through an animal rights group that was supporting me. And it's important for you to know that of all the candidates he supported, no one ever called us and said, don't prosecute him, don't look at his case. We never, ever got those calls. None of those people who received money ever once tried to intervene in this case. It's made up.
There's a whole lot to unpack here, and the one part of this that we haven't really gotten into yet, and I think it's really important, is race and the role that it plays. As you well know, Black Lives Matter activists, LGBTQ activists have been very vocal on this. You've had folks protesting outside of these very offices for more than 100 weeks. As the first African American to hold this post, what is it like for you to have those people outside protesting, saying you are not doing things right, you are not doing enough, you are not doing it quickly enough?
Yeah. It's difficult. I grew up like a lot of the people that are out there protesting. I can identify with the frustration of watching so many men of color get killed in our country and wondering why. My parents lived through the civil rights era, and they exposed me to a lot of that because they never wanted me to forget about what it was like and what it is like to be an African American in this country, particularly a man, how hard it is for a man. I think what's frustrating for me is no matter how much time I spend trying to explain it, it's never enough. It's never enough.
So what do you think's going on with that? What do you think is behind this when you have, I mean, and look, when you've got someone like Representative Karen Bass telling the LA Times that the image that she is seeing here, that Ed Buck was not arrested after the death of Jamel Moore, and she said, and I'm quoting here, I think the message that was sent was young gay black men don't count. Yeah. Sitting here with you now, I don't think that you think that.
Well, I hope Miss Bass is listening.
But what's going on here? What's the disconnect?
It's about the evidence. It really is about the evidence. You'll see in some town halls, people start screaming and yell at me and say, you don't need any evidence. Just play the tape we saw on the news. That is not our system. That's not our justice system. You have to have evidence. One day I feel that when it's all said and done, people will realize that the LA District Attorney's Office tried, that we put a lot of resources in it. The unit that was assigned to the Ed Buck case was one of my most elite trial units, the major crimes unit. They do nothing but try cases. They don't really settle a lot of cases. They go in there because they're the best litigators in our office. And, you know, we did our best.
Ed Buck may now be behind bars, but a much larger, more vexing issue remains. A look at some of the deeper